The audible groans from the congregation were barely muffled by the soaring hymns as Karen briskly strode down the church aisle, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. All eyes were on her, the late arrival disrupting the reverent atmosphere. With a defiant toss of her perfectly coiffed hair, Karen slid into the last available seat, shooting an unapologetic glare at the usher who dared to shoot her a disapproving look. This was hardly the first time Karen had strolled in late to the Sunday service. In fact, her tardiness had become something of a running joke among the churchgoers. Yet, her sense of entitlement and disdain for the rules that governed everyone else never wavered. Karen firmly believed that her time was more valuable than anyone else's, and the rigid schedule of the church service should bend to accommodate her whims. As the sermon droned on, Karen fidgeted in her seat, her manicured nails tapping an erratic rhythm on the hardwood pew. The pastor's words seemed to wash over her, failing to penetrate the bubble of self-importance that encased her. She couldn't help but notice the sidelong glances and hushed whispers from her fellow parishioners, but she dismissed them with a haughty toss of her head. When the time came for the offering plates to be passed, Karen reached into her designer handbag, extracting a crisp bill and placing it in the plate with an ostentatious flourish. The act was not one of genuine generosity, but rather a calculated display of her affluence and importance within the congregation. As the plate moved on, Karen leaned back in her seat, a smug smile playing on her lips. However, the self-satisfaction etched on Karen's face quickly morphed into shock and indignation as the pastor's booming voice suddenly cut through the air. "My dear friends, I have a special announcement to make," the pastor began, his gaze sweeping across the congregation. "It has come to my attention that one of our members has been consistently late to our services, disrupting the sacred worship and setting a poor example for our younger congregants." Karen's heart raced as the pastor's words sank in, and she felt a bead of sweat trickle down her spine. Surely he couldn't be referring to her, the most prominent and generous donor in the church. Surely he wouldn't dare call her out in front of everyone. But as the pastor turned to face the back of the church, his piercing eyes locking with Karen's, she knew her facade of invincibility had been shattered. "Karen, if you would please come up to the front and address the congregation," the pastor said, his voice tinged with a hint of disappointment. Karen's face flushed with a mixture of humiliation and rage as she reluctantly rose from her seat, the eyes of the entire church following her every step. As Karen made her way to the front of the church, she could feel the weight of every disapproving gaze burning into her back. Her carefully curated image of perfection was crumbling, and she cursed herself for not being more diligent in maintaining her facade of punctuality. Stepping up to the podium, Karen's eyes swept across the sea of faces, each one reflecting a mixture of judgment and pity. She cleared her throat, determined to regain control of the situation, but her voice wavered slightly as she spoke. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, Pastor," Karen said, her tone dripping with feigned innocence. "I have always been a devoted member of this congregation, and I take my faith very seriously." The pastor's eyebrows rose, and he fixed Karen with a stern look. "That may be true, Karen, but your actions have not reflected your devotion. You have been consistently late to our services, disrupting the worship and setting a poor example for our younger members." Karen's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to protest, but the pastor raised a hand, silencing her. "I have received numerous complaints from our ushers and fellow parishioners about your behavior," the pastor continued. "They have expressed their concerns that your tardiness and lack of respect for the sanctity of our worship services is setting a poor example for our community." Karen felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger. How dare these people criticize her? Didn't they understand how important she was to the church? Her mind raced, searching for a way to regain the upper hand, but the pastor's next words stopped her in her tracks. "Karen, I'm going to ask you to please make a commitment to be on time for our services from now on. If you continue to disrupt our worship, we may have to take disciplinary action." The congregation erupted in a chorus of murmurs and nods, and Karen could feel her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. She had never been challenged like this before, and the thought of facing consequences for her actions was unthinkable. As the pastor stepped back, Karen stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, unable to find the words to defend herself. The realization that she was no longer in control was slowly sinking in, and Karen knew that she would have to find a way to regain her power before it was too late. As the congregation murmured and shifted uncomfortably in their seats, Karen felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. She had always been the untouchable queen bee of the church, her status and wealth shielding her from any real consequences. But now, standing before the entire congregation, she found herself stripped of her usual defenses. Karen's mind raced, desperately searching for a way to regain control of the situation. She couldn't let the pastor and her fellow parishioners see her weakness. That would be an unforgivable sin in her eyes. Squaring her shoulders, she leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she addressed the congregation. "I'm afraid there has been a misunderstanding," Karen said, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "You see, my tardiness is not out of disrespect for our church or our faith. It's simply a matter of my busy schedule and the numerous obligations I have outside of these walls." She paused, letting her words sink in, and then continued, "I'm sure you can all understand how difficult it is to balance the demands of a successful career, philanthropic work, and family life. Sometimes, despite my best efforts, I simply can't arrive on time." Karen glanced around the room, searching for any sign of sympathy or understanding in the faces of her fellow churchgoers. But instead of the acquiescence she had expected, she was met with a sea of skeptical expressions and furrowed brows. "That may be true, Karen," the pastor interjected, his voice firm. "But your tardiness is still disruptive to our worship, and it sets a poor example for our younger members. We're all called to be good stewards of our time and to honor the sanctity of our services." Karen felt a surge of indignation rise within her. How dare the pastor challenge her, and in front of the entire congregation, no less? She opened her mouth to retort, but the pastor raised a hand, silencing her. "I understand that your commitments outside of the church are important, Karen," the pastor continued. "But I'm going to ask you to make a concerted effort to arrive on time from now on. If your tardiness continues, we may have to have a more serious conversation about your involvement in this congregation." The threat hung in the air, and Karen felt a cold chill run down her spine. The idea of being disciplined or, worse, expelled from the church was unthinkable. Her status and influence were so deeply intertwined with her membership that the very notion sent a shockwave of panic through her. Swallowing her pride, Karen nodded reluctantly, knowing that she had no choice but to comply. But as she returned to her seat, a plan was already forming in her mind, a way to regain control and ensure that her tardiness would never be an issue again. As the service came to a close, Karen made a beeline for the exit, determined to escape the prying eyes and whispered criticisms of her fellow parishioners. Her face burned with a mixture of humiliation and anger, and she could feel the bile rising in her throat. How dare they challenge her, the most prominent and generous member of this congregation? Once outside the church, Karen took a deep, steadying breath, trying to regain her composure. She couldn't let this incident affect her standing in the community, not when so much was at stake. Pulling out her phone, she quickly scrolled through her contacts, finally landing on the number of her personal assistant. "Lucy, I need you to do something for me," Karen said, her voice clipped and authoritative. "I want you to start arriving at the church 15 minutes early every Sunday and check in with the ushers. I need to know if anyone else is consistently late, and I want you to keep a record of it." Lucy, sensing the urgency in her boss's voice, quickly agreed. "Of course, Karen. I'll get started on that right away." "Excellent," Karen replied, a predatory smile spreading across her face. "And make sure to keep me informed of any new developments. I'll handle the rest from here." Ending the call, Karen's mind raced with the possibilities. If she could catch the other late arrivals in the act, she could use that information to her advantage. Perhaps she could shame them in front of the congregation, just as the pastor had done to her. Or maybe she could threaten to withhold her generous donations unless they shaped up. The options were endless, and Karen relished the thought of regaining her control over the church. As she made her way to her car, Karen couldn't help but feel a sense of triumphant anticipation. She had been caught off guard this time, but she was determined to never let it happen again. The congregation would soon learn that when it came to Karen, there were no rules, only her way. For the next several Sundays, Karen's personal assistant, Lucy, dutifully carried out her instructions, closely monitoring the arrival times of the other churchgoers. Armed with this information, Karen began to formulate her plan of attack, her mind whirring with schemes and strategies. During the services, Karen observed her fellow parishioners with a critical eye, searching for any signs of tardiness. Whenever someone slipped in late, disrupting the flow of the worship, Karen would make a show of glancing at her watch and tooting disapprovingly. She took particular delight in locking eyes with the offenders, her gaze a silent challenge. As the weeks passed, Karen's plan began to take shape. She started by approaching the church's board of elders, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "I've noticed that there seems to be a growing issue with tardiness among our congregation," she said, her brow furrowed in a show of worry. "It's really quite troubling, don't you think? The disruption to our services is simply unacceptable." The elders, eager to please the church's most prominent donor, nodded gravely, assuring Karen that they would address the problem immediately. Karen smiled inwardly, knowing that her influence would ensure that her desired outcome was achieved. True to their word, the elders instituted a new policy. Anyone arriving late to the service would be required to sit in the back pews, away from the main congregation. Karen reveled in the knowledge that her plan was working, and she couldn't wait to witness the humiliation of her fellow parishioners. Week after week, Karen would sit in the front row, her eyes scanning the sanctuary for any latecomers. When someone dared to slip in after the service had begun, she would turn and fix them with a triumphant glare, watching as they scurried to the back, their faces flushed with embarrassment. The other churchgoers, sensing Karen's satisfaction with the new policy, began to whisper among themselves, their voices tinged with resentment. But Karen didn't care. She had regained her control, and that was all that mattered. As the weeks turned into months, Karen's hold on the congregation only tightened. She had become the self-appointed arbiter of punctuality, her word law within the church walls. And with each passing Sunday, she grew more and more emboldened, her sense of entitlement and privilege reaching new heights. Little did she know, however, that her actions were sowing the seeds of her own downfall, as the resentment and frustration of her fellow parishioners began to simmer beneath the surface, waiting to boil over. The tension in the air was palpable as the congregation filed into the church, their eyes nervously darting around the sanctuary. Karen, as always, was seated in the front row, her back ramrod straight, her gaze sweeping across the room with an air of unshakable confidence. This Sunday, however, something felt different. The usual hush of reverence that fell over the service was tinged with an undercurrent of unease, and Karen couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease herself. Still, she refused to let her guard down, determined to maintain her iron grip on the proceedings. As the service began, Karen kept a keen eye on the doors, ready to pounce on any latecomers. Sure enough, a few minutes into the opening hymn, the familiar sound of heels clicking against the hardwood floor echoed through the church. Karen whirled around, a triumphant sneer already forming on her lips, only to freeze in her tracks. It wasn't just one or two latecomers. It was an entire group of them, all marching down the aisle with a determined stride. Karen's eyes widened as she recognized the faces, her heart sinking with a realization that she had not anticipated. These were not just random churchgoers. They were the very elders who had implemented the policy at her behest. And in a stunning act of defiance, they were all deliberately arriving late, knowing full well that they would be forced to sit in the back. As the elders took their seats, the congregation erupted into a chorus of murmurs and whispers, the air thick with tension. Karen felt her face flush with a mixture of shock and outrage, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. The pastor, sensing the unrest, stepped forward, his brow furrowed with concern. "My friends, it seems we have a bit of a situation here," he said, his voice cutting through the din. "I understand that there have been some concerns about tardiness, but I don't believe that singling out or shaming our fellow parishioners is the way to address this issue." Karen's heart raced as the pastor's words echoed through the church, and she felt the weight of every disapproving gaze upon her. She opened her mouth, desperate to defend her actions, but the pastor raised a hand, silencing her. "Karen, I'm going to have to ask you to refrain from any further efforts to enforce this policy," the pastor continued, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's clear that it has created more division than unity, and that is not what we strive for in this community of faith." The congregation erupted into a smattering of applause, and Karen felt the last vestiges of her control slipping away. She sat there, stunned and humiliated, as the service continued, the once revered figure now reduced to a mere bystander in her own church. The drive home from church was a silent and tense affair for Karen. Her knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel, and her jaw was clenched so tightly that it ached. The humiliation she had experienced in front of the entire congregation was a bitter pill to swallow, and she was determined to find a way to regain her power and status within the church. As she pulled into her driveway, Karen took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions swirling within her. She had spent years cultivating her image as the most influential and generous member of the church, and the thought of it all crumbling around her was almost too much to bear. Storming into her house, Karen immediately summoned her personal assistant, Lucy, her eyes blazing with a newfound determination. "Lucy, I need you to do something for me," she said, her voice dripping with a dangerous edge. "I want you to dig up as much dirt as you can on those elders who dared to defy me. I need to find something, anything, that I can use against them." Lucy, sensing the gravity of the situation, nodded hesitantly. "Of course, Karen. But are you sure that's the best course of action? It could really backfire and make the situation worse." Karen waved a dismissive hand, her mind already racing with possibilities. "I don't care about the consequences, Lucy. I need to regain control of this situation, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Turning on her heel, Karen strode into her home office, her thoughts consumed by a single, unrelenting goal: revenge. Over the next few days, Karen pored over the information that Lucy had gathered, her eyes narrowing with each new revelation. She discovered a range of financial irregularities, questionable personal relationships, and even rumors of infidelity among the elders. With a twisted sense of satisfaction, Karen began to formulate her plan of attack. Summoning the elders to a private meeting, Karen unleashed her carefully curated evidence, her voice dripping with feigned concern and outrage. She painted a picture of corruption and betrayal, skillfully manipulating the information to cast the elders in the worst possible light. The elders, caught off guard and unprepared for Karen's onslaught, found themselves on the defensive, their protests and denials falling on deaf ears. Karen, sensing their vulnerability, delivered the final blow, threatening to withhold her generous donations unless the elders resigned from their positions immediately. Faced with the prospect of losing the church's primary source of funding, the elders had no choice but to capitulate. One by one, they submitted their resignations, their heads bowed in defeat. And as Karen watched them leave, a cold, triumphant smile spread across her face. She had won, but at what cost? The church, once a place of community and spiritual unity, had become a battlefield, and Karen's thirst for power had transformed her into a ruthless and unforgiving adversary. As the dust settled, Karen found herself perched atop the power structure of the church, her influence and control now seemingly unassailable. The once respected elders had been unceremoniously removed, their reputations tarnished, and Karen reveled in the knowledge that she had emerged victorious. However, her triumph was short-lived, for the whispers and murmurs that had once plagued her had now transformed into outright hostility and resentment. The congregation, once cowed by her wealth and status, had grown weary of her heavy-handed tactics and uncompromising demands. One Sunday, as Karen strolled down the aisle, her head held high, she was met with a stony silence that sent a chill down her spine. Gone were the furtive glances and hushed conversations. Instead, the parishioners fixed her with a collective gaze of disdain and contempt. Undeterred, Karen took her seat, determined to weather the storm. But as the service progressed, she found herself increasingly unsettled by the palpable tension in the air. The pastor's words, once a source of comfort and inspiration, now felt hollow and distant, as if the congregation had erected an invisible barrier between themselves and the church's leadership. It was during the offering that Karen's world truly began to crumble. As the plate was passed down the pew, Karen reached into her purse, her fingers closing around a crisp bill. But as she moved to place it in the plate, she noticed that the people around her were not following suit. One by one, the congregants simply passed the plate along, their hands remaining firmly in their laps. Karen's heart raced as she realized the significance of this silent protest. Her financial stranglehold on the church had been broken, and with it, her sense of invincibility. Panic surging through her, she hastily placed her own offering in the plate, her movements hurried and desperate. As the service drew to a close, the pastor stepped forward, his usually warm and welcoming demeanor replaced by a somber, almost accusatory, expression. "My friends," he began, his gaze sweeping across the congregation, "it is with a heavy heart that I must address a troubling situation within our community. It has come to my attention that some among us have been using their wealth and influence to manipulate and control the affairs of this church." Karen felt the blood drain from her face as the pastor's words struck her like a physical blow. She knew, without a doubt, that he was referring to her, and the realization that her carefully constructed facade had been shattered was almost too much to bear. "This is not the way of our faith," the pastor continued, his voice tinged with a steely resolve. "We are called to be humble, to serve one another, and to put the needs of the community before our own. And it is time that we return to those principles, no matter the cost." As the congregation erupted into a thunderous round of applause, Karen sat there, stunned and defeated. Her reign of terror had come to an end, and she knew that there was no place for her in this church anymore. Slumping in her seat, she felt the weight of her actions finally catch up with her, and she knew that the true reckoning had only just begun.